Okay guys, so this lecture is going to talk about fungi. Fungi are very interesting organisms. They're not plants. A lot of people tend to think of fungi as plants. These guys are not photosynthetic, which is one of the characteristics of plants. So these guys are not technically plants. They're more closely related to animals in that sense than they are plants. So let's go ahead and talk about them and some of the differences and some of the characteristics of fungi. So the study of fungi is known as mycology. Someone who studies fungi is a mycologist. Pretty easy to figure that one out. So bacteria and fungi play two important roles that nobody else in the environment plays for us. And those are the roles of decomposers. Dead organisms, things that die, whether naturally, diseases, or get hit by cars and things like that, they got to go somewhere. If they don't, their little corpses will accumulate on the sides of the roads or just wherever they die, and we would be walking around up into our ankles very quickly in dead organisms. That would be very bad as they rotted, very dangerous as disease spread and things like that. So fungi and bacteria, fungi play a really big role in this as well, particularly in the form of plants and rotting wood and things like that. Bacteria are a little more apt to do this for living organisms, flesh, and things like that. So trees die, plants die as well, and they have to go somewhere else, or we'd be walking around on nothing but dead trees. So both of these guys together play a really good role in getting rid of those two types of dead organisms: dead trees, dead plants and things, and dead animals and dead birds and whatnot. So the nutrients that are held within inside of those organisms, things like carbon and nitrogen and the different types of atoms that are used to put them together, the elements, are going to be recycled back into the environment as they're broken down by the fungi and the bacteria through metabolism and just the bacteria and fungi eating them, using them for food and fuel. Once the bacteria and fungi have broken those dead animals and things down, those nutrients will then go back into the soil, and then they can be used again by something else to build up another tree or something like that to get food for them. So without the fungi and without the bacteria, dead organisms would pile up very quickly all around us, and that would not be much fun. So fungi play a very important role in that. They do a lot of other important things, but that's just one of the big ones that they play for us. Now, almost all of the mushrooms, fungi, not all fungi are mushrooms, but all mushrooms are fungi, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But all fungi, or most of them, I should say, excuse me, are going to be terrestrial. This one right here is called a chytrid. It's kind of like some kind of horrible brain alien or something. These are the only aquatic phylum of fungi. Some fungi can live in or around the water, but these guys live only in the water, this particular phylum of fungi. So the vast majority of fungi live on the land, terrestrial, but some of them, like chytrids, are all aquatic, and we'll talk about that, the differences in the different types of phylums and things in just a minute. So fungi are unicellular in some instances, like yeast. This is yeast down here, one cell. And you can see the little budding yeast cells off to the side, the little baby yeast and things that will be eventually budded off and create a new yeast cell. Single-celled organisms capable of doing every thing that a cell needs to do to be alive. While some of them, on the other hand, are going to be organized into very highly specialized structures like mushrooms and things like that. You can either have multi-celled fungi or single-celled fungi, and they come in both forms. But no matter which form you come in, if you're unicellular or multicellular, you're going to have a cell wall made out of chitin, and that's one of the characteristics of fungi. They all have this sugar chitin that makes up the cell walls inside of their cells. It's also the same sugar that makes up the exoskeleton of insects. So if you like to eat mushrooms on your pizza, technically it's the same sugar that makes up cockroach exoskeletons. It's not, but in a paper it is. It's interesting on that. Once again, they lack chlorophyll. They cannot make their food via photosynthesis. They have to get all of their food from another source, which means they're heterotrophic. And these guys all primarily reproduce by spores. And then we'll talk about spores in just a second. It's kind of like a little primitive seed structure kind of thing. Now, if you're a unicellular fungi, this does not apply to you, but multicellular fungi, these big guys over here, they're going to have the vast majority of this fungus is not going to be visible to you. What you see here is the reproductive structures. The mushrooms, as we call them, are the reproductive structures that will be producing the spores. These are only going to be produced when the fungus is going to reproduce, and the rest of the time, the fungus, the non-reproductive part of the fungus, is going to be found living underneath the ground in the form of little small filaments. They look sort of like roots called hyphae. It doesn't look anything like this. This mushroom here is just a very highly organized mass of hyphae into the form of a mushroom. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So you only see a little tiny bit of this fungus that's visible during the reproductive cycle, and the rest of the time when it's not reproducing, the significantly larger portion of the fungus is going to be hidden underneath the ground. So here's the basic fungal life cycle. Pretty much every single fungus is going to pretty much roll by the same life cycle. Not all of them do, but for the most part, the vast majority of them do. And this is kind of the catch-all of how to explain this. So start with an adult mushroom over here, the reproductive structure, and it's going to produce some diploid spores. Those diploid spores are going to essentially be kind of baby seed kind of things. They're not really seeds. They don't have a seed coating. They don't have any real food and kind of things inside of them. It's just kind of a baby fungus without any. It's just literally like a baby fungus kind of thing. I can't think of anything other way to say that more basically. It's just an empty little ball with a baby fungus inside of it. So those spores will be released from the underside of the mushroom. This is called the cap right here. In the gills, you can see the little slits underneath. The gills are where the spores are produced, on the little slits underneath. They will be dispersed into the wind or on an animal or a bug or something, or maybe on your clothes or whatever. If you brush up against the mushroom, you will carry the spores, the wind will, to somewhat other location. The spores will land on a new environment, and they will germinate. They will become active. They will start to grow and divide, and this is where the hyphae comes into play, the little hyphae-like roots. Now, they're not really roots. They don't absorb nutrients in the way that we think of it. They don't absorb water in the way that we think of it. They don't transfer nutrients and things around. They function like roots, as in the sense that they hold the fungus to the ground. They do allow for nutrient exchange, but it's a totally different form of nutrient exchange than plants do. So they're not really roots. They just kind of function the same way that roots do. This is a great example of convergent evolution. If you need to be held to the ground, you're going to form pretty much the same way to do it. So those small little germinates, the tiny little hyphae, will grow and grow and grow. And you can see here eventually forming a very large mat of fungal hyphae called the mycelia. And that's the big giant blob of hyphae that lives underneath the ground, is the mycelia. So once that mycelia is ready to reproduce, it will grow its fruiting body, its reproductive structures down here. And then the reproductive structures can sprout up anywhere along that giant mycelium mat of hyphae underneath the ground. Pretty much anywhere the hyphae is found underneath the ground, the little mushrooms can spring up from. The mushrooms will produce more spores, which are then released back into the wind or whatever, and start the cycle over again. And this is pretty much how funguses reproduce. Not all of them, but for the most part, this is a very basic, simplistic interpretation of that. So every single fungus on the planet is heterotrophic. None of them can make their own food via photosynthesis. They look sort of like plants, but they're not green. And that's one of the characteristics of being able to make your own food. You have to be green to be able to use photosynthesis kind of thing. Well, anyway, since they're heterotrophic, the way that they get their food is very different than the way that you and I get our food. They don't eat their food the way that we do. They don't chew, they don't break it down and digest it inside of them. They undergo something called a saprophytic life cycle. Saprophytic feeding, which is very interesting way to look at this. If you know anything about spiders, the way that they feed, they wrap their little victim up in a little cocoon of silk, injected the spider venom inside. The spider venom digests the little creature inside of its exoskeleton, and then the spider comes back and pretty much sucks it out like a milkshake, liquefied bug intestines. And this is essentially what a fungus does. The little hyphae, now keep in mind the mushrooms are only present during the reproductive cycles. The mushrooms don't eat, but the rest of the year and the rest of the time, the hyphae has to eat. So how does the hyphae feed itself? Well, the hyphae, wherever it grows along this piece of wood, the hyphae probably goes all out in here. You just can't see it. It's going to grow underneath the bark. It's very small, very hard to see. It's almost microscopic. You can't really tell that it's there. It's going to spread probably all the way around this tree, all the way here. So what's going to happen is anywhere that hyphae is going to touch, it's going to be secreting digestive enzymes from its cells. Its digestive enzymes will then go out into the wood. Fungi are really good at breaking down things called lignins, which are chemicals that are found in plants that allow them to transport water around, and it's one of the things that makes wood so strong is lignin. So fungus can break down that lignin, their digestive enzymes, and when they break down that lignin, it breaks it down into sugars. It's going to digest the cellulose as well, and all that stuff, and it's going to break down all of the plant matter, all of the wood, into just a kind of a soupy blob of nutrient soup. And then the hyphae, the little hyphae cells, will suck up that nutrient soup, and then the fungal cells will be able to digest the nutrient soup. So it's kind of like extracellular digestion. Very interesting way to eat. Well, as the digestive enzymes go along and destroy things, they digest it. The wood will get weak. Eventually, it will be removed as it's digested and eaten. As the fungus grows, it will grow out farther and digest more and more of this log. And then eventually what will happen is the log will be totally eaten away by the fungus as it grows. And the same thing happens to animals, dead organisms, or if you get a fungal disease, the same thing happens to us. The hyphae want to eat you. You are their food. So the hyphae try to eat our flesh and try to eat our skin as food. So very interesting way of acquiring food through a saprophytic lifestyle. Now, some organisms, some types of fungi, practice pure saprophyticism on non-living organisms or dead organisms and things like that, while some of them practice parasites. They will live on living organisms and try to eat them. Some fungi do that, some of them don't. Saprophytics they're all saprophytic. If you're saprophytic on a non-living tree, you're not going to hurt anything. But if you're saprophytic living on an animal or living on a human or something like that, that's going to cause some severe pain. So that's what the parasites versus non-parasites are. So saprophytic life cycle, very interesting. Now, there are quite a few fungi on the planet that we've identified, almost 75,000 species that we know about. But it's estimated that there's almost 5 million or so different species of fungi that we don't know about yet. And the reason for that is they're really tiny, microscopic. It's hard to see things that you can't see, hard to find them if you don't know they're there. They live in very tiny little niches, little tiny micro environments that may only be found, underneath the right side of the human pinky nail on 2% of the population kind of thing. So it's evolved for such a very specific environment that it's very hard to locate. So there's probably billions and millions and millions of different species of fungi out there that we just don't know about. But the 75,000 that we do know about are broken down into about 7 different phylum of fungi. Now, phylum is essentially just a group of organisms that are all very similar in function to one another, that are related. So there's about 7 different phylum of fungi, and we're only going to talk about 5 of them or so for this particular little lecture. Now, the very first phylum that we're going to talk about is the aquatic phylum, Kitridiomycota, commonly known as Kitrids. So Kitrid fungi are very dangerous. They are parasitic fungi, and they live on amphibians, things like frogs down here, toads, newts, salamanders, little things like that, that live in the water or around the water. Now, Kitrids are totally aquatic fungi. They live solely in and around the water. They don't live on the ground, on the land. They have to have a damp soil, damp environment. Well, anyway, so do amphibians. So a little frog hops along and comes into this pond. The Kitrids live in the pond already. The Kitrids will land on the surface of the frog's skin. That's where they like to live. Now, they're not going to try to eat the frog. They're going to grow along the surface of the frog's skin. So they're going to digest just a little bit of the frog, but they're going to more live on him kind of thing. They're just going to live on him. Well, as they grow across the surface of his skin, if you know anything about how frogs breathe, amphibians breathe, they breathe through their skin. And this would essentially be like you trying to breathe through your skin, or as a better way to put this, breathing over regularly, and then trying to put a balloon over your head or a plastic bag over your head, and then trying to breathe. As these chytrids grow across the skin of these amphibians, it chokes their ability to breathe and they suffocate. So the chytrids are very, very dangerous to amphibians. It kills them very quickly, very, very detrimental to amphibian populations. They're not super common, or they used to not be in this part of the world. They like a little more warmer water. They tended to be found a little more south in Central America, South United States, and now they're starting to make their way into the Tennessee as our climate has started to warm a little bit and waters have started to warm in the United States. We find them more often here. Once they cause a case of chytrids, infections have set up inside of a pond or a lake or something like that, the really only one way to get rid of them is to drain the lake, leave it dry for a couple of months because these guys can survive in damp soil, and to cover the soil with high strength lye, which is essentially just calcium, to very, very basic environment to kill these guys. And even then, it's not guaranteed to prevent the infection from coming back. Once they get into a pond, they can decimate an aquatic population of frogs very quickly, and I think it takes about 2 weeks or so for a frog to die from a chytrid infection. And there's really nothing you can do to cure it once it sets up shop. We don't really have enough information to stop these once they start. So chytrids are very dangerous to amphibians, not so much to humans, although I can't swear on that one. But I know they are very dangerous to amphibians. Now, Glomeromycota is probably the most important phylum of fungi for life on Earth. Now, plants, if you recall back to the nitrogen cycle, bacteria are the only things on the planet that can recycle nitrogen from the soil, from nitrogen into just elemental nitrogen into the form of ammonia, to make it useful for plants and other organisms. Bacteria are the only thing that can do that. Now, how do they do that? We'll talk about that later. But where do they do that is a better way to talk about that. And this is where these guys are kind of come into play. So, if you know anything about farming, or if you've ever heard a farmer say, I'm putting nitrogen back into the soil, or I'm planting a crop that puts nitrogen back into the soil, like soybeans or something, what they're doing is they're planting a crop that's very often has these type of fungi living on the roots. A member of the phylum Glomeromycota. Almost pretty much every type of tree plant has them. Some of them just have different versions of these that are better functionality than others. So anyway, what happens is you plant the plant, the roots grow down in the ground, and it attracts these fungi to them from the soil. Glomeromycota fungi will colonize the roots of the plant and live on the roots of the plant. The plant provides them a nice safe place to live, the roots. It also gives them a little bit of sugar via photosynthesis. And the roots are about to do something which is very important. See these little balls here? They're called heterocysts. And what happens is bacteria from the soil that fix nitrogen. Every single piece of soil on the planet has bacteria that fix nitrogen in it. The bacteria from the soil will migrate from the soil into these little heterocysts here. They're little bacteria apartments. Now, instead of fixing nitrogen out in the soil, where that nitrogen is not useful for anything, they're now fixing nitrogen inside of this little heterocyst here. That nitrogen that's fixed inside of the heterocyst can then be used by the fungi to give to the plant in exchange for the plant giving it food via photosynthesis. So it's a straight-off program. This guy works as our middleman to get the bacteria into the environment to give the plant the nitrogen, the fixed nitrogen in the form of ammonia. So without this fungi, no nitrogen would be fixed and that would be ever entering the human population or anything higher than just bacteria. So these guys are very, very, very important for life on Earth to continue the way that we know it. Now, these guys are very sensitive to changes in soil pH. Things like acidic rain really damage them. And they started to see mass die-offs of these types of fungi along the equator, where acid rain tends to be very concentrated. So if these guys are not capable of evolving quick enough to survive the changing soil acidity, we're in for some very interesting consequences once the future hits us. So once these plants die, once the fungus dies, the plant that it's attached to can no longer get the nitrogen that it needs, so the plant then dies. Well, when the plant dies, it quits producing oxygen, which means anything that breathes oxygen dies as well. So these are very, very, very important for keeping life on Earth going as we know it. Zygomycota. This is commonly known as bread mold, or it's a very common example of a phylum member from Zygomycota, phylum fungi in the phylum Zygomycota. These guys mostly live on the ground. There's a couple of them that are aquatic. And they're saprophytic for the most part. They're just going to be living on non-living matter, growing on pieces of bread and things like that, dead animals. But some of them will act as parasites of plants and insects. Now, if you've ever seen the exoskeleton of a bug, it looks kind of like a suit of armor. And essentially what happens, you can see the little hyphae down here. And this is the reproductive structure of the hyphae down here, the little root-like systems. These little hyphae, imagine this growing between the chink of your suit of armor, between the joints at the arms, the joints in the knees, and then the fungi, little hyphae now growing inside of your body. And that's essentially what happens to the poor little bugs. The fungus lands on their exoskeleton. The hyphae then grow around on the exoskeleton until they reach a joint in the bug's exoskeleton. The hyphae then grows in between that joint and then grows inside the bug. And eventually it will eat the bug from the inside out. So kind of horrifying, but kind of cool on this one as well. So this is the reproductive cycle for the phylum Zygomycota. They have different types of spores. They have something called zygospores. You can see them here. They're diploid. What happens is this zygospores, fungus can reproduce either sexually or asexually. We'll talk about the asexual reproduction first. Very simple. Asexual reproduction. You have spores that are haploid. Haploid spores are produced that are haploid. They float out into the environment. They start another haploid cell, another haploid colony. Very easy to understand on that one. Just asexual reproduction. The spores land. The asexual spores are produced haploid. They land somewhere. The haploid cells grow into another haploid fungus. Very easy on that one. Now, the diploid, the sexual formation of fungus, is a little more complicated, but still pretty easy. You have the haploid fungi and another haploid fungi. You can see the haploid here and haploid here. What's going to happen is the two haploid fungi are going to mate. You can see that occurs here. Now, they're not male and female in the way that we understand it. They're positive and negative type thing. They don't really have X and Y chromosomes. Now, you have haploid and haploid mixing to form a diploid cell. You can see that here. That diploid cell will then form something called zygospores, which are diploid spores. They're genetically different than their parents. So these zygospores will then be put up on a little stalk. You can see that here. This is common for Zygomycota members. They have that little paintbrush-like look kind of thing, like a dandelion sort of. And then they work the exact same way. So once the spores mature, they will be pushed off into the wind via air or whatever, and then starting the process over, they land and start the process over, and then mate, and then they can go this way. So very interesting, the two types of reproduction for fungi in the phylum Zygomycota. Now, Ascomycota, very, very important fungi, probably the most important fungi for humans, and not necessarily just life on Earth, for this particular fungus right here. This is penicillin. Penicillium chrysogenum is the fungus that we get penicillin, the antibiotic, from. It was discovered in the 1920s, 1929, by a guy named Alexander Fleming. He happened upon it after he left a plate of bacteria out on his desk, and this fungus grew on it and killed all the bacteria that was on that plate. Now, he didn't throw the plate away like the majority of all microbiologists would do. He looked down at it and, well, oh, there's some bacteria there when I left. There aren't now. What happened? And then he did a whole investigation to figure out where it came from, and it turns out it was mold that killed the bacteria. Fast forward 10 years, 3 more guys come along, Alfred Fleury, Howard Chain, I can't remember the other guy's name, They come along and they do all the research and figure out how to make penicillin a useful drug, a marketable drug, and then they revolutionize the world with the invention of antibiotics from this fungus right here. Now, funguses and other things like that produce these antibiotics to kill other bacteria and other fungus in their environment that are trying to steal their food. If you live near me and I can kill you, I get all the food that you'd be eating, and that's essentially the entire point of an antibiotic. Humans just figured that out, and it does so happens to not kill us, and we can use it for killing the bacteria inside of us. Tons of chemicals are produced by funguses that kill us and bacteria that are used for the same purpose. They just kill us at the same time, so we obviously can't use them for antibiotics. Antibiotics just happen to be the ones that don't kill us. Now, penicillin is in this phylum here, but mildew, the stuff that grows on your shower, is also in this phylum. Mold, the mold that grows in your house, not black bread mold, like the mold that grows on your wall and in your basement and stuff like that, is going to be in this phylum. Morels, this is a morel here. They're very, very sought out for culinary purposes. They're highly edible. They're really good. They're very expensive. They only grow after forest fires. You can only go get them from the wild, pretty much. It's very hard to grow or to farm these. So people make a really good living scrolling around in the woods trying to find these things. And then Saccharomyces is another really important member of this particular phylum. This is yeast that's going to be used to brew beer and to make bread. So without yeast in this phylum, Ascomycota, we wouldn't have most of the foods that we enjoy, breads, or any type of alcoholic beverage or anything like that. And then truffles are going to be included in this group as well. So if you like the flavor of truffles on your pasta and things like that, this phylum is a good phylum for you. Lots and lots of the members of this family, however, are pathogenic to humans. This particular one here, Aspergillus, kills quite a few people in the United States every year and also around the globe. It's a very common fungus that's found in hay and straw and things like that. And in healthy individuals, it really doesn't ever cause a problem. But if you're immunocompromised, it can get you very quickly. And it's a respiratory fungus. It grows in your lungs, and then it can kill you very, very, very quickly. So Ascomycota are very commonly known as cup fungi, and you can kind of see why down here. They look sort of like cups when they're getting ready to reproduce. You can see the little cup down here. They produce their spores on little things called ascocarps. They produce ascospores. Pretty easy on this one. Now, I'm not going to go super high in depth on how these things reproduce. It's very similar for all of the different phylums of fungi, but they have the exact same mating here between the two haploid partners to produce a diploid zygote. That diploid ascospore will be released into the environment and then start the process over again with a haploid fungus. So it's very similar to the rest of them. Again, if you want a little or more information on this one, see the supplemental videos that are included. Now, Basidiomycota. If you think of a mushroom, this is what you're going to think of. These are mushrooms. So once again, what you're seeing here is the reproductive structure of this phylum. It's not going to be the fungus itself, or the whole fungus. The fungus lives underneath the ground. It's probably quite large, and it lives underneath the ground. And anywhere along the hyphae, where the underneath the ground where the hyphae touches, the little reproductive structures, the mushrooms, can pop up from. Now, these guys, their spores are called Basidiosports, matches the phylum again, and they're produced on little specialized structures called basidium. Now you can see here, the cap, the gills, is and the stalk are the three different things, the parts of the mushroom. Underneath the ground is all the hyphae that are the feeding parts of the mushroom. Now, you zoom in on this whole thing, and you can see the little basidia here, the infills and of the gills, the infoldings. You zoom in on those, and the basidium produce 4 little spores, basidiospores, on the ends of them. These little spores will eventually be released into the environment. They will float away on the wind or whatever, and start a new fungus wherever they land in the environment. So here's the reproductive cycle of the fungus, phylum Basidiomycota. Very similar to all the rest of them. You have that mating process over here. Right here. Oh, sorry, right there. You have that mating process where the two haploid nuclei are going to fuse. It's not really an exchange of sperm or eggs kind of thing. It will grow that mushroom once that occurs. That's their reproductive structures. That reproductive structure will then produce those diploid basidiospores. Those diploid basidiospores will then divide again via meiosis into, haploid basidiospores. Sorry, those are basidia, not basidiospores. Here's the basidiospores over here, sorry. When those haploid basidiospores will then be released into the environment, starting a brand new cycle over again. So the mushroom that you are familiar with if you eat them is essentially just a blob of very highly organized hyphae that's entire purpose is just reproduction. So you can see all the hyphae underneath the ground, the mycelium, all that big blob of hyphae right over here. And then the mushroom can sprout up from that hyphae wherever it fuses like this along the way. It's just that big highly organized blob of hyphae to specialize in reproduction. And then you have lichens. Now, lichens are kind of an interesting little mix of a plant in the form of an algae and a fungus. Now, it was commonly thought for a really long time that a lichen was going to be two organisms, one fungus and one algae. And they work together to give each other a home. The fungus can't produce his own food, but he can work kind of like the rebar in concrete. Now, the algae can produce its own food, and it works like the concrete around the rebar to hold everything in place. So the fungus provides a nice, safe place for the algae to live, nice, strong structure for the algae to live on, and the algae, in turn, for having that nice, safe place to live, will produce food and grow on that structure. And produce the food for the fungus. So it's a working relationship, a mutualistic relationship of these two types of species living together. Now, it was commonly thought for a really long time that it was just two species. Well, it turns out that lichens are actually three species of organisms living together, either two algae and one fungus, or two funguses and one algae. It just depends on the different type of lichen. Lichens, the fungus version is not photosynthetic, so that non-photosynthetic partner, the fungus, is called a mycobiote. Fungus friend is the word meaning here. And then the photosynthetic partners, the algae, are known as photobionts, the photo friends, light friends kind of thing. So once again, they work together to provide the growth medium for the algae to grow on, and then the fungus provides a nice, safe place for the algae to live on in exchange for some food. So they give each other trade-offs. For thousands of years, these lichens have been removed from trees and used to make medicines and traditional dyes and things for cultures throughout the world. There's three different types of lichens. You can see them fairly commonly if you go outside and look. This is called fruticose, this is foliose, and this is crustose right here. And we'll go over each one of them in just a second. So fruticose lichen tends to stand quite tall. It grows a lot on rotten woods and things. I had an old dumpster at the apartment that I used to live in that had a wooden fence around it. And that entire wooden fence was just covered in these red soldier lichen, red cap lichen, or British soldier lichen. They have a couple of different common names. You can kind of see why the red soldier, British soldier lichens. But red cap lichen is the most commonly used name for this particular one here. Now, the little red balls that you see are the spores of the fungus going to be reproducing, where it's released into the environment. So very, very interesting little lichen here. The lichen will produce these little red spores only during the breeding season, when it's breeding, and then once it's not, the little red spores go away, and you just see the little structures sticking up without the little red balls on them. Now, our foliose here grows a lot on rocks, also on trees and things. So this one looks a lot like a salad to me. It looks like lettuce. And then you've got crustose over here. And this is very close to the rocks that it grows on, concrete. If you have ever been to a cemetery, this is that stuff that grows on tombstones, gravestones. I mean, you can scrape it kind of off with your thumbnail kind of stuff. Very, very close to the rock. It also grows on trees a lot. So you will commonly find these three types of lichen mixed together in the environment. It's not uncommon to find all three of them even growing right next to one another on the same type of tree, on the same branch for that matter. So lichens are very interesting. Multiple organisms sharing one little location to the benefit of all three of them. And then you've got leafcutter ants, which are kind of an interesting little organism that farms fungus. So leafcutter ants, you've probably seen videos of them walking around in the jungle. They live in South America. And they walk through the jungle and they cut off pieces of leaf with their giant jaws here. Now imagine carrying this little tiny ant here, carrying this giant leaf. It's about 6 times his size, very strong. So they carry these little pieces of leaf back to their house. Now they don't eat the leaves. What they do is they carry the little pieces of leaf back to their house and they add it to their garden. They will have a garden of fungus that they do eat. The fungus eats the rotting leaf, and essentially what will happen is a new colony of ants will bring with them a little small piece of fungus. They will add that little small piece of fungus, say in the middle of their colony, and they will start adding pieces of leaf to it that they're harvesting from the environment. That fungus will grow and digest the leaves, and in turn, the fungus will get larger and larger. They will add more and more leaves to it that will be digested, making more and more fungus. And essentially, what's going to happen is the ants will eat that fungus. That's what the ants feed off of. They feed it to the queen, to their larvae, and that's what they eat. So they don't eat the leaves, they eat the fungus. And they provide the fungus food with the form of these leaves. If their garden fails, they will all die. If they want to start a new colony, if it gets too large, they'll take a piece of the old colony's fungus with them and start a new colony somewhere else. So very, very, very interesting way of farming ants, for ants to farm. Now, the weird part about these things is sometimes these funguses can grow so much faster than the ants can eat them. Or even feed them for that matter. And the hyphae can grow so fast it can destroy the colony. Because it grows mushrooms. So if they let the hyphae grow too much and grow too fast and they feed it too long, it will start to grow mushrooms, which can break the colony and destroy it and things like that. So the ants have to eat it before the mushrooms can form, or else they risk damaging their colony when the mushrooms form. So very odd, kind of a race between time for leafcutter ants. And that's pretty much all I've got for you guys over the little brief introduction to fungi. If you have any other questions on how these things work or anything at all, please feel free to send me an email. If not, have a good rest of the day.